Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And there are times in history when events occur that have wide-ranging consequences. And one of those events occurred in South Carolina in what was called the Stono Rebellion. And Chris, the Stono Rebellion was a slave rebellion that occurred, I believe it was just like 20 miles south of the North Carolina border. And it had impact not just simply in South Carolina, but in North Carolina and indeed across the entire slaveholding colonies.
Yeah, you got many things that are going on during this time. It's always important when you're studying one particular aspect of history that you look at the broader view of what was going on. And so we're looking at late summer of 1739. As you mentioned, we're kind of down there in South Carolina. And, one thing that is going on in this particular area is there has been a smallpox epidemic that has raged through the area, and yellow fever is spreading. So you've going to have less of a workforce. In addition, you have found a bumper rice crop. So it's a really good season for rice. And the problem is yellow fever, you have less people to be able to actually work, bringing that rice crop in. And then also you have the hurricane season that's going on during this time. And right there, kind of near the coast, it's always some concern. And then there's also this worldview where you've got Britain and Spain that are talking about war. Spanish Florida has basically said, hey, if there's any people who are enslaved, we're offering freedom to runaways. And so what's happening to these planters and farmers is they're experiencing just so many different things that are coming on, and they're trying to balance that out while still really treating the enslaved in a very barbarous way.
Yeah, slaves had very bad treatment, especially the further south you go. You know, before the American Revolution, um, while there was slavery in almost all the colonies, the further north you got, the fewer slaves you had. Doesn't mean slaves were necessarily treated much better, but you had fewer slaves. The majority of slaves were in the South and in those deep South colonies like South Carolina. And this was a brutal form of slavery. And Chris, you know, one thing we talk about how they were treated, slaves were treated in a particular way, a very inhumane way a lot of times, in order to maintain the institution of slavery, or what one historians called the peculiar institution. You know, slavery had to be built and maintained by that constant threat of violence, whether it was a whipping, whether it was a hanging, or slave patrols, or whatever it was. Slavery was built on that, foundation of violence and threat. And white enslavers, and even whites in places like South Carolina that maybe didn't have slaves, were constantly aware of the danger of rebellion, constantly aware of the danger of uprising and what's going to happen if these slaves, who in South Carolina at one point outnumber free whites, what's going to happen if these people revolt in a way and come after us. I mean, they're in our homes, they're on our farms, they're on our plantations. What's going to happen if they revolt? So there's constant fear, and that fear results in worsening treatment for these slaves. And I think, Chris, that probably played a role. It did play a role in leading up to the Stono Rebellion, and certainly in the aftermath of the rebellion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you are being treated inhumane, and even to the point where the Colonial Assembly in South Carolina had passed a law that required planters to go to church armed with a weapon, just in case at any given moment's notice there would be a slave revolt or an escape. And as we mentioned earlier, the Spanish in Florida had created a law, or given amnesty, if you will, and said basically any runaway slave that makes their way to Florida has the opportunity to receive freedom. And so that was very enticing. You're living in this situation here in South Carolina, And so individuals are like, if there's a way out, let's do it. And so what happens is on September the 9th, uh, in the cover of darkness, there's about 20 slaves who had been working on a drainage ditch. That was their moment. That was their opportunity. They said, we're going to go and we're going to leave the area and we're going to head down to Florida. And most of these had come from Angola. And they were led by an enslaved man whose name was Jimmy. And they broke into a general store and they were able to grab some gunpowder and some weapons. The problem is, Ray, that as they broke into that place, there were two white individuals that discovered them in the store, grabbing all of these supplies. And this is where the story takes that turn because the slaves, understanding what was to happen if they were to go back to their place. If these white individuals would have, quote, captured them and brought them back to the slave masters, they knew that they were dead. And so the only thing that these enslaved people could do is to kill the men and to keep going. And not only did they kill the men, but they actually beheaded those men.
Yeah.
And you kind of understand why, because of the injustice that these people have faced by the white person. And they left their heads on the front steps of the store, and they basically didn't have a plan. They just knew if we can get to Florida, we'll be all right. And so, Ray, they leave the general store and they start and they basically keep on going. And Ray, there's just a lot of violence that takes place from the time they leave the general store trying to accomplish their mission.
It was an act of desperation. These were desperate people looking for freedom, looking for a new life. And as you said, Florida represented that new life. Florida was the golden, the goal of what they were trying to do. You talked about the events there at the store. But it wasn't just those two men, of course, that were killed. They burned plantations. They killed somewhere between 22, 23 to 30 people in the process. And as they went, Chris, they picked up more and more and more recruits. But it is interesting that some of the people they tried to recruit said, no, because, there is a knowledge among the enslaved people that this type of rebellion is likely not to be successful. And when the people involved are caught, bad things are going to happen.
Yeah, to the point where, some of the slaves would actually hide their masters.
Yeah.
Because they were afraid of what was going on. Other enslaved actually drove off the rebels and said, "You're not welcomed on our property. We're not getting involved in your mess. You need to go on somewhere else." I do find it interesting that these runaway slaves made their way to a place that was called Wallace Tavern. And they had kind of been in the midst of going to homes and plundering the homes and setting homes on fire. And they get to Wallace's Tavern and they kind of go in and they take a minute and they actually pour themselves some drinks. And they have a minute sitting at the bar, if you will. And what's interesting about that encounter is that they did not kill the owner. Now, they have pretty much been on a blood path. They have killed just about anybody they've come into contact with. But in this moment at Wallace Tavern, they spare the owner because the owner had been kind to his slaves. And that just shows the understanding that the enslaved, you were right about it being a desperation, but they weren't in it to kill. They were in it to find freedom. And so they understood, this person has taken care of his people. Yes, we abhor slavery, but he's been kind to them. So we're going to spare him. And, and they do pick up, I think, 50, 60 additional people to be part, of this thing. And then, Ray, it gets really interesting because the sun rises. This is all done in the cover of darkness. And yet when the sun rises, they've made a banner, they've got drums, and basically they are just walking down the road challenging slave masters, to come after us and singing and crying out the words, liberty, 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 hoping that more rebels or more enslaved would join the rebel cause, but also just kind of in that bold thing that you can't touch us. And I mean, after all, you're walking down roads where houses are on fire and there's
Yeah.
heads on doorsteps. And I mean, so they had tried to instill a sense of fear and danger as they were doing this.
Do you think there may have also been a little taunting going on? That look, here
Oh,
we are, we're out in
absolutely.
the open in the day, and here we are.
Yes, I absolutely. And what would have been the result if it hadn't have been a coincidence when the lieutenant governor, who just happens to be riding his
Hmm.
horse along the way with some other white planters, they saw what was happening and they almost got captured by this rebel group. And as they leave, then they start sounding an alarm. And of course, what happens when the lieutenant governor starts saying there's a problem, you're going to get more people involved. And, uh, there was some taunting going on, but Ray, it kind of catches up to them because what happens is they get tired of all of this, makes it tiring.
Yeah, and the governor is going to come back with a large militia. I think I've read somewhere between around 100 men. This militia is going to come back and it's going to find Jimmy and his people. They're going to be caught up at a place called the Edisto River, which is there in South Carolina. And there's going to be a quite an intense firefight that happens there. And at the end of it, I think almost 50 of the slaves lay dead, but over 20 of the militia also lay dead, which is that shows how intense this firefight was, because that's not a small number, when you're considering that the militia may have had 100 people in it, 100 men in it, and you're getting 25 casualties somewhere in that ballpark. That shows how well armed Jimmy and his people and his group was. Um, and so they lost. The slaves ultimately lost. Jimmy and his group ultimately lost, but they inflicted quite a lot of damage on the militia that took them down.
Yes, a lot of damage to those that took them down, but also you have to start thinking about the repercussions of what they
Yes.
did and how it would affect the other enslaved, because this rebellion, what it basically does is you start to see a fierce manhunt. You have patrols that start going out where individuals are found and they are massacred, if you will. It is gruesome. You have slave masters who start treating slaves. Maybe they were kind to them at first, but now because of this, they are, not so kind to them. And
Mhm.
you see all of these things that are going on. However, I do think there is another side to this, that there are some of these slave planters who did give thanks to their enslaved who protected them and
Mhm.
did provide them with additional money and some clothing, and so that aspect was a little bit better. But for the most part, this rebellion creates a series of fear and panic among the planters and the plantation owners, because there are these tensions that are just going to continue to get wider and wider and wider and wider. And that is where you start seeing the assembly make a bunch of different rules and regulations that are going on. And for the good, there are some good things that happen with this. I think one of the rules was that slave owners had to allow a day off now, where the enslaved were given Sundays off so that they could rest. They also had to provide them with food and with clothing, and I think there was some penalties if you were to murder them. But at the same time, the colony also tightened some of the restrictions on some of the enslaved also.
Yeah, they also started a school um, to try to teach the Christian doctrine. Of course, I'm sure it was very one-sided. None of this Moses let my people go stuff. But they did start schools. They did pass laws laying penalties on slaveholders who were use excessive force. Not sure how often those type of laws were actually enforced. But one thing that I found interesting in looking at the aftermath, and even today when something happens, there's the blame game. Who knew what, who knew it when, type of thing. Then there was a little of that going on, and a part of that was the idea that, okay, the slaves that are responsible for the Stono Rebellion and other rebellions that happened in Georgia and South Carolina, these are recently arrived slaves, allegedly. And so the idea was, well, we need to sort of put a cap on this and really focus more on growing our slave population internally. So we need to focus more on natural reproduction of slaves. And they put like a 10-year moratorium on importing slaves into like Charleston. So the idea was we're going to really grow our slave population and not depend as much on the importation of slaves. Now, after that 10-year period, they sort of forgot all about that. Time passes and, people they don't forget, but, the emergency sort of has passed and they start importing some slaves again. And then, of course, in the Constitution, it ended the importation of slaves throughout the country. I believe it was in 1808, was it?
Right. I think.
Yeah. So they do start making changes. South Carolina does in the structure of how they're operating. They really crack down on slaves not being able to grow their own food, slaves assembling in groups, teaching slaves to read, which this is going to become a big issue not just simply during the Great Awakening, but especially during the Second Great Awakening, where a lot of Methodists and Presbyterians and others move into the South, trying to evangelize slaves, even though the slave codes that are passed throughout the colonies in the South mainly say, yeah, converting to Christianity doesn't change your status. So it has a major change, not just the Stono Rebellion, but other rebellions that are happening invoke major changes throughout the colonies.
And I think that goes to show that these colonies were still trying to figure things out as they were going along. And because remember, we still have this life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, this,
right.
This desire to achieve the American dream, which was being only given to a certain group of people. And so there is a lot that is going on. And I wonder, when you think about South Carolina and then there's Florida, that was a long distance to get from South Carolina to Florida, but it's not like we had Google and maps and things of that nature. I mean, these enslaved people just knew of a dream. They knew if I could just get to Florida, it would be well worth it. Well, Ray, if you and I, we're kind of almost at the border of North Carolina and South Carolina, but you're talking about a 6-hour drive just to get to Florida, driving from where we are. So imagine you have these enslaved people who have no idea how far of a walk it is, how far to get to that place, but it's freedom on the line. It's life on the line. And in their minds, they're thinking we're doing it not just for ourselves, but we're doing it for liberty. We're doing it for that thing that we hear talked about with all of the white individuals, but it's limited and we're not allowed to get it. So Ray, they were willing to walk. They were willing to do whatever they could because they didn't know how far, but it was liberty that they were trying to get to. And they thought, one more step, one more moment, and maybe, just maybe, I'll get liberty for myself, but also for all of my people. And so there's a lot there that takes place during this Stono slave rebellion, if you will, that will, as you say, lead to just massive changes that happens. And they do it in the aspect of liberty.
Yeah, and I wonder, and I have no historical basis necessarily for this, but I wonder if they had in mind, once they got down there, maybe trying to start something like an underground railroad, a way to get to funnel slaves. So I don't know that even crossed their mind, but
I don't know if the Underground Railroad was something that they were thinking about because these guys walk down the street in the middle of the day
that's
saying
true.
liberty, liberty, beating the drums. I think in their mind, they thought that fear more than anything would be what would sell the day. And you have to, I mean, you have to, I've lost the word, but their brazenness to do it because and you're walking down the streets of South Carolina, which is one of the most slave holders are there on those plantations near the banks of the Charleston River. I mean, they just had this mindset that I don't care.
Yeah.
I'm going to do this. And so I think they would have been happy, as they tried to do, to have gained. I don't know, maybe they were thinking they were going to get thousands of enslaved that were going to join the crusade. And that, in my opinion, they were just going to walk down the road and nobody was going to touch them because they were going to have an army of rebellious people. And does that make sense? And so
It does. It does. It makes more sense than what I was thinking. Because they are this is sort of in your face type of thing.
Yeah, as you
that they
mentioned,
do.
taunting. I mean, and the fear. I mean, they burned houses. I mean, with children, and I mean, they wanted that fear. They wanted to, because can I say, they wanted the white plantation owners to experience the same fear that they had
Right.
experienced, because
Yep.
that's all they knew. So
Yeah. There is like I said at the beginning of the episode, if you're at the South Carolina, North Carolina border, I think it's sort of on the eastern side. It's about 20 miles south, the Stono Rebellion. It's about 20 miles south, maybe a little more. There is a landmark there, the historical landmark, the Stono Rebellion. And it says here about 20 Africans raided a store near Wallace Creek, a branch of the Stono River. Taking guns and other weapons, they killed 2 shopkeepers. The rebels marched south toward promised freedom in Spanish Florida, waving flags, beating drums, and shouting liberty. So the history is told in a very condensed way. I love these historical markers on that historical marker down at near the Stono River.
it's interesting comparing the word rebels.
Yeah.
You think about the rebels that was mentioned there on that sign.
Right.
And then you think about the Civil War and the rebels.
Mm-hmm.
That word has 2 totally different meanings. If you the rebels of the enslaved were fighting for liberty. The rebels in the fight of the Civil War were fighting to keep liberty away from some individuals.
Yep.
Just an interesting way that you look. And that's a national monument that's out there, but I thought it was interesting that it talked about these rebels. It kind of has this negative connotation to it when, they were trying to get freedom, just like, other rebels. I don't know.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. One thing I read a number of years ago, and it sort of goes toward this idea that slaves were happy and content and all this. And the author of the study was looking at slave runaways and stuff and things like that and the numbers. And what it found is it didn't really matter the context in which the slave lived and worked. It could have been a large plantation or a small farm. Slaves ran away at the same numbers, which meant there was something that they wanted, and what they wanted was freedom. And as you said, there were a lot of Southern whites, the vast majority, who wanted to not just simply deny it to them, but do whatever they had to do to prevent them from getting it. And much later, this particular rebellion happened in 1739, but much later in the antebellum period, South Carolina's the guy from South Carolina, oh gosh, what's his name? Calhoun, John C. Calhoun. He didn't just simply say we're going to defend slavery. He said slavery is a good thing. So, you see that how it was not just simply preventing freedom, but doing everything they could to keep the slaves from being free.
Because it was never happy, and it never was a good thing.
No, absolutely not. I mean, people wanted freedom. That's it. They wanted freedom. And that's what all people want, really, at the end of the day. All right, Chris, a great episode, other than my mind going blank there. I have a unique talent. I can forget what I'm talking about in the middle of a sentence. All right. So I hope our listeners enjoyed this episode. Please check us out on Spotify, YouTube, anywhere else you get your podcasts. Give us a like, give us a share, and we'd appreciate it. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
Talk to you later.